Donald Trump Jr. leaned back in his chair with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly challenged on live television. The Newsmax studio lights caught the gleam of his cufflinks as he gestured dismissively toward the split screen where Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett waited with perfect stillness. His smirk was already forming before the host finished the introduction. "Look, I respect that she got elected and all," Trump Jr. began, his voice dripping with the patronizing tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. "But let's be honest about what we're dealing with here. This is someone who was a public defender in Texas. A public defender. Do you know what that means? It means she couldn't cut it at a real law firm. It means she spent her career defending people who couldn't afford actual lawyers. And now she's lecturing my family about business ethics, about financial accountability. That's rich. That's actually hilarious." He laughed then, a sound meant to invite the audience into shared contempt. The Newsmax host smiled uncomfortably, sensing something in Crockett's absolute stillness that Trump Jr. seemed oblivious to. "She's part of this DEI wave that's infected politics," Trump Jr. continued, warming to his theme. "Diversity hire, affirmative action all the way up, no real qualifications except checking boxes, and now she thinks she can interrogate people who've actually built things, who've actually created jobs, who've actually succeeded in the real world. It's laughable. My family has built a business empire worth billions. She defended criminals for the state of Texas. But sure, let's pretend those are equivalent credentials." The camera caught Crockett adjusting a single piece of paper on the desk in front of her. Her expression had not changed. She made a brief note with a pen, the movement precise and unhurried. Something in her complete lack of reaction seemed to register with the host, whose smile had frozen into something more uncertain. Trump Jr. was still talking, his voice rising with the rhetorical energy of someone who believes momentum equals victory. "I mean, this is what the Democrats do, right? They find someone who looks good for their diversity quota, someone who can read talking points, and they put them in front of cameras and hope nobody asks real questions. Because when you actually examine her record, when you actually look at what she's accomplished beyond winning an election in a district that would vote for anyone with a D next to their name, there's nothing there. She's a resume patter. A credential faker. And now she's coming after my family with accusations she can't back up and qualifications she doesn't have. It's offensive, frankly." The host turned to the split screen. "Congresswoman Crockett, I assume you'd like to respond to that?" Jasmine Crockett's voice, when it came, was quiet enough that the audio technician had to adjust levels, not because she was speaking softly, but because the contrast between Trump Jr.'s volume and her measured calm was so stark it registered as a technical error. "I appreciate Mr. Trump sharing his thoughts on my qualifications," she said. The camera showed her hands folded on the desk, completely still. "I want to make sure I understand his position correctly before I respond. He stated that being a public defender means someone couldn't succeed at a private firm. Is that an accurate summary of what you just said?" Trump Jr. laughed again. "I mean, yes, obviously. If you were good enough for Sullivan and Cromwell or any real firm, you'd be there. Public defenders are the people who couldn't make it in actual legal practice. That's just reality." Crockett nodded once, a small movement of acknowledgement. "Thank you for confirming that. And you stated that I have no real accomplishments beyond winning an election in a Democratic district. Is that also accurate?" "Yeah, that's accurate. Show me what you've built. Show me what you've created. You can't because you haven't." "I appreciate the clarity," Crockett said. Her tone remained perfectly even, as if she were taking deposition testimony rather than being attacked on national television. "I'm going to respond to both of those claims with documentation, and then I'd like to ask you about your family's business practices since you've raised the question of real-world success. Does that seem fair?" The host nodded eagerly, sensing that the segment was about to become considerably more interesting than the scheduled talking points. Crockett lifted the single piece of paper from her desk. The camera zoomed in enough to show official letterhead, though not enough to read the text. "This is a letter from the Baylor University School of Law, where I graduated. I'm reading from it now. Quote, Ms. Crockett completed her Juris Doctor with honors, ranking in the top 15% of her class, with particular distinction in constitutional law and criminal procedure. She was recruited by 4 private firms during her final semester, including 2 national practices." End quote. She set the letter down with the same careful precision she'd used to pick it up. "I chose public defense work, Mr. Trump. I was not relegated to it by lack of options. I chose it because I wanted to ensure that people who couldn't afford $800 an hour attorneys had someone who actually understood the law fighting for their constitutional rights. That choice apparently confuses you, which tells me more about your value system than it does about mine." Trump Jr.'s smirk had faded slightly, but he recovered with a dismissive wave. Okay, great, you chose to defend criminals, congratulations. That doesn't change the fact that you've never built anything, never created jobs, never operated in the real economy where results actually matter. Crockett picked up a second document. During my 6 years as a public defender, I represented over 400 clients. My trial record was 78 wins, 12 losses, and 53 negotiated outcomes that kept innocent people out of prison. In 2019, I identified a pattern of prosecutorial misconduct in the Dallas County DA's office that resulted in the exoneration of 14 individuals who had been wrongfully convicted. Those 14 people had collectively spent 87 years in prison for crimes they did not commit. The state paid $2 million in settlements. I built their freedom, Mr. Trump. I created 14 futures that had been stolen. I operated in an economy where results meant whether human beings lived or died behind bars. The silence that followed was noticeable enough that the host glanced at the control booth. Trump Jr. recovered first. That's great. Really touching. But we're talking about business, about economics, about the real world of commerce where my family operates. You don't know anything about that world. You're right that I don't operate in your family's specific business sector, Crockett acknowledged. Let me see if I can learn. You mentioned your family's business empire. Can you tell me the current status of the Trump Foundation? The question landed like a technical foul in a basketball game. Perfectly legal, but unexpected enough to change the momentum completely. Trump Jr.'s face shifted. Something in his eyes suggested he knew exactly where this was going. The Trump Foundation was dissolved years ago. That's public record. What's your point? It was dissolved by order of the New York State Attorney General after a 2-year investigation found a pattern of illegal self-dealing, correct? That was a political witch hunt. The findings were issued by a court, not a political office. I'm reading from the settlement document now. She lifted a third page, this one noticeably longer. Quote, the Trump Foundation engaged in a pattern of illegal conduct persisting over more than a decade, including unlawful coordination with the Trump presidential campaign, repeated self-dealing transactions, and failure to follow basic legal obligations applicable to all charities operating in New York. The foundation was ordered to pay $2 million in damages, and all 4 Trump children, including yourself, were required to undergo mandatory training on nonprofit legal obligations. Is that accurate? Trump Jr.'s hand had moved to his collar. Those charges were politically motivated. We settled to avoid further. You settled because the evidence was documented across 65,000 pages of financial records subpoenaed by the Attorney General's office. I have the settlement agreement here. You personally signed it. Would you like me to read the section where you acknowledge the findings? The host was no longer smiling. The energy in the studio had shifted entirely. What had begun as a platform for Trump Jr. to attack Crockett's credentials had become something else entirely. Crockett continued, her voice still perfectly measured. Let me ask about another family business venture, Trump University. Are you familiar with that entity? That was settled years ago, Trump Jr. said quickly. Ancient history. It was settled for $25 million to 7,000 students who were defrauded by false advertising about the program's educational credentials. The program claimed to offer instruction from hand-picked experts and my father himself. Internal documents showed that many instructors had no real estate expertise and that your father had no involvement in curriculum or instruction. Students paid as much as $35,000 for programs that were described by former employees as, quote, a fraud from beginning to end. You were listed as a trustee of the organization during its operation. Is that accurate? Trump Jr.'s face had reddened noticeably. I was a passive trustee. I had no operational role. You gave testimonials for the program in promotional videos. I have transcripts of 3 separate appearances where you personally vouched for the quality of instruction. In one you stated, and I'm quoting you directly, my father handpicked these instructors. These are the people he trusts to teach you the same methods that built our family's success. That testimonial appeared on promotional materials sent to over 80,000 potential students. Is that a passive role, Mr. Trump? The silence that followed was longer than the first. 10 seconds, 15. The only sound in the studio was the ambient hum of the cameras. 20 seconds. Trump Jr. finally spoke, his voice lacking the swagger it had carried minutes earlier. I was asked to support a family business venture. I supported it. That's what families do. Even when the venture is defrauding students? That's not. We settled that case. There was no admission of wrongdoing. Crockett set down the Trump University documents and picked up a thin folder. Let me ask you about another business practice. Your family's hotel operation in Washington, D.C., the Trump International Hotel. While your father was in office, that hotel charged the Secret Service $4 million for rooms during his presidency. That's not in dispute. It's documented in federal spending records. What is in dispute is whether those charges represented fair market rates or inflated prices that effectively transferred taxpayer money to your family business. Do you recall testifying to Congress that your family charged the Secret Service, quote, cost or very minimal profit as a courtesy? Trump Jr.'s hand was gripping the armrest of his chair. We charge standard rates. The General Services Administration found that the Trump Organization charged the Secret Service rates as high as $1,185 per night for rooms that were being offered to regular guests at $500 per night during the same periods. That's not standard rates, Mr. Trump. That's more than double. And it's not a courtesy when the taxpayer is being charged premium prices to protect a president staying at his own property. There were special requirements. The same rooms, same floor, same amenities. The only difference was the guest paying. When it was a private citizen, $500. When it was the United States Secret Service, $1,185. Over 3 years, your family business collected $4 million in taxpayer funds at rates that the GSA determined were, quote, not consistent with comparable properties and raised significant concerns about fairness to the American taxpayer. You sat on the board during this entire period. You signed off on the rate structure. Is that accurate? Trump Jr. stood abruptly. The movement was so sudden that the camera operator had to adjust. I didn't come on this show to be ambushed with, you came on this show to question my qualifications, Crockett said. Her voice had not risen. She remained seated, her hands still folded on the desk. You stated that I had never built anything, never created jobs, never operated in the real economy. I'd like to understand what you mean by real economy. Is it an economy where charities are dissolved for illegal self-dealing, where universities defraud students and settle for $25 million, where hotels charge taxpayers double rates to house the agents protecting the property owner? Trump Jr.'s microphone picked up his breathing audibly faster now. This is exactly what the left does. They take perfectly normal business practices and turn them into, I'd like to ask you one simple question, Mr. Trump, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. Crockett lifted one final document from her desk. This is the Trump Organization's financial disclosure from 2019. It lists you as Executive Vice President. In that role, you oversaw acquisitions and development. Can you name a single project completed during your tenure that came in under budget, was delivered on time, and did not result in legal disputes with contractors? The silence that followed was absolute. 5 seconds, 10, 15. The host shifted in his seat. Someone in the control booth could be heard clearing their throat through an open microphone. 20 seconds. Trump Jr.'s jaw worked as if forming words that would not come. His hand moved to his collar again, then to the microphone clipped to his jacket. 25 seconds. This interview is over, he finally said. The words came out rough, lacking any of the smooth confidence that had opened the segment. He reached for the microphone pack at his waist. Crockett spoke once more, her voice still carrying that same measured calm that had not wavered once in 15 minutes. Before you go, I want to address your opening statement. You called me a diversity hire. You suggested I was unqualified. You implied that my background was inferior to yours. I'm a graduate of a top-tier law school who chose public service over private profit. I have a trial record that would be envied by any litigator in the country. I identified systemic injustice and corrected it at institutional scale. You are the son of a wealthy man who has been involved in 3 separate entities that either settled fraud claims or were dissolved by court order for illegal practices. Those are the facts. Those are the records. Those are our actual qualifications, documented and public. Trump Jr. had removed his microphone entirely. He stood, his face a mottled red that the studio lights rendered even more dramatic. You know what? Go to hell. This is exactly why nobody trusts the media anymore. You ambush people, you take things out of context. Everything I cited came from court documents, federal records, or your own public statements, Crockett said. If there's anything inaccurate, please correct me. I have the source documents here. Trump Jr. did not respond. He walked toward the studio exit, his movement stiff and visibly angry. The camera caught him saying something to a producer off-screen, the words inaudible, but the tone unmistakable. The host turned back to Crockett, clearly unsure how to proceed. Congresswoman, that was certainly not the discussion I expected to have today. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to respond with evidence rather than rhetoric, Crockett said. Mr. Trump opened this conversation by questioning whether I had the qualifications to hold my office or to examine his family's business practices. I believe the American people can judge for themselves whether the evidence I presented answers that question. She paused, and for the first time in the entire interview, something shifted in her expression. Not anger, but something colder and more final. I spent 6 years fighting for people who couldn't afford to fight for themselves. I know what it looks like when someone with power uses that power to exploit people without it. I know what it sounds like when someone mistakes inherited wealth for earned credibility. And I know what happens when you actually examine the record instead of accepting the performance. She gathered the documents in front of her into a neat stack, the movement precise and unhurried. Mr. Trump suggested I don't understand the real world of business. He's right about one thing. I don't understand a business model built on defrauding students, inflating charges to taxpayers, and illegal self-dealing through charitable foundations. I don't understand that model because I was taught that real success means building something that serves others rather than extracting value from them. If that makes me unqualified in his eyes, I'll accept that judgment gladly. The camera held on her for a moment longer. Somewhere in the studio, a phone was ringing. The host was receiving instructions through his earpiece, his expression suggesting genuine uncertainty about how to close the segment. Crockett spoke once more, her final statement before the program cut to commercial. I came to Congress to hold powerful people accountable when they abuse the public trust. That's not a partisan objective. That's not a diversity initiative. That's the job I was elected to do, and it's the job I did as a public defender for 6 years before that. If examining someone's actual record rather than their self-promotional rhetoric is considered an ambush, then I suppose we have very different definitions of accountability. The screen cut to commercial, but the clip was already being uploaded by a dozen different sources within seconds. The moment Trump Jr. had stood and removed his microphone, the 25 seconds of silence before he ended the interview, Crockett's final statement about the difference between inherited wealth and earned credibility. Each segment was complete enough to function independently, requiring no context to land with devastating clarity. By evening, the full interview had accumulated over 3 million views across platforms. The comment sections were remarkably consistent in their reaction, shock at how completely the confrontation had reversed from its opening moments. Trump Jr. had entered as the aggressor, armed with contempt and certainty. He had left in silence, unable to answer a simple question about his own business record. Political analysts would spend the following days parsing the exchange, noting how Crockett had used Trump Jr., his own documented history, as the weapon against him. She had not argued. She had not defended. She had simply presented evidence piece by piece, each document confirming a pattern that transformed his opening attack into an indictment of his own credibility. The contrast between Trump Jr.'s bluster and Crockett's precision became the subject of dozens of think pieces about preparedness versus performance, substance versus style, documented reality versus self-mythology. Media training experts use the interview as a case study in what happens when someone mistakes aggression for strength and encounters someone who has done the actual homework. But perhaps the most telling response came from the absence of response. Trump Jr. did not address the interview on social media. He did not issue a statement. He did not appear on Newsmax again for over a month. His silence after the interview was longer and more complete than the 25 seconds that had preceded his exit. Jasmine Crockett returned to her congressional office and continued the work she had been doing before the interview, reviewing federal spending reports, preparing for upcoming committee hearings, responding to constituent requests. The viral moment was secondary to the actual work. The confrontation was not the objective. Accountability was. In the weeks that followed, 3 separate journalists requested the source documents Crockett had cited during the interview. She provided them without comment, each citation verifiable in public records. The Trump Foundation settlement, the Trump University judgment, the Secret Service billing records from the Washington Hotel, the 2019 financial disclosure listing development projects that had resulted in contractor disputes. Every claim she had made was documented. Every question she had asked was based on information that could be verified by anyone with access to federal databases and court records. The interview ended Donald Trump Jr.'s appearance, but it began something more substantial, a broader conversation about what actual qualifications look like when examined against actual records rather than inherited reputations. Crockett had not humiliated him for entertainment. She had held him accountable for the specific claims he had made about her background versus his own. The contrast between between those two records, when documented rather than asserted, told a story that no amount of performance could overcome. The Newsmax studio, hours after the interview ended, remained oddly quiet. The crew had witnessed something they hadn't expected, not a political debate, but a systematic dismantling built entirely on verifiable evidence. The host, in a moment captured by a crew member's phone and later shared privately, had simply said, "She brought receipts, he brought a smirk. That was never going to end well." The empty chair where Trump Jr. had sat remained in the studio for the rest of the broadcast day, a visual reminder that some confrontations end not with dramatic conclusions, but with the quiet devastation of documented truth against unsupported bluster. Crockett had asked for nothing more than answers to simple questions about publicly available records. The inability or unwillingness to provide those answers spoke louder than any accusation she could have made. By the time the studio closed for the evening, the interview had been shared over 400,000 times. The most replayed moment was not the evidence presentation or the document citations, it was the silence. 25 seconds of a powerful man, confronted with his own record, unable to speak. In that silence, everything Crockett needed to say had already been communicated. The truth, when documented and presented without rhetoric or performance, required no additional commentary. It simply was, and that, ultimately, was the most powerful statement of all.